Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 32nd episode of By-The-Bywater. Glad to have you with us. We are recording when there is rain and storms and things, and it's been a day, but we're not minding. This is the West Coast going, yes, please, water. Yeah. Thank you.
Good weather for tales, very
Yes.
Tom Bombadil.
It's Goldberry's washing day.
It is Goldberry's washing day.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, dear. And before we get into things, because there's some interesting bit of news that we only just recently learned about. We're like, oh, yes, this will be interesting to talk about. I do believe Oriana can now publicly talk about her big bit of news. Yes.
Yeah. It's very exciting. I'm going to be a TV writer. I got into the Warner Brothers TV Writers Fellowship, which just started this week. And it's just kind of like TV writer boot camp, and then you kind of go off and staff on one of their shows, theoretically, unless you're a horrible jerk and no one likes you. But hopefully I won't have that problem. We'll see.
You'll be fine.
So when the eventual, LOTR, spin-off anime series that Oriana does comes to life and all that, so theoretically you could end up on that Dune spin-off series that's happening.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of actually genuinely cool stuff. Like Warner Brothers also is the Sandman series that's coming to Netflix.
I thought that was just a Netflix thing, but okay.
Warner Brothers television, baby.
Yeah, DC.
Yeah.
They decided to farm it out to Netflix, I guess, instead of keeping it on HBO Max or whatever. So maybe some other factor involved. So, geekery. We could go on. But anyway, congratulations to Oriana.
Oh my God!
Congratulations!
Yay!
It is great stuff. It is well deserved. We've certainly, we've been privately talking about this for a while. It is wonderful to see that, and fame, fortune, and all the good stuff. Here's to it happen. We'll take a casual mention in the Emmy thank yous eventually.
Yeah, obviously.
Gotta start somewhere. Clearly. Okay, so with that out of the way, we'll just get right into the news. As mentioned, we do have some interesting news. So, Jared, please, as always, do take it away.
I love this news, actually. So with the Nature of Middle-earth now released, it's back to a waiting game to see what more news will come out about Amazon's upcoming series. And while there's been no new official announcements of any kind, we have learned a bit more about what one of the actors will be doing. Lenny Henry, whose formal casting had been announced months back, said in a recent UK radio interview that he's specifically playing a hobbit, specifically a Harfoot, adding, "We're multicultural. We're a tribe, not a race, so there are black, Asian, and brown, even Maori types within it." Yeah, Henry went on to say that his own guess is that the story would take 10 years to tell. Let's just say, that's a nice dream, but TV series plans usually don't work that way, as anyone who saw the Battlestar Galactica reboot can tell you. Henry added that there's a very strong female presence in this. There are going to be female heroes in this evocation of the story, and further noting that the Silmarillion, whose influence was hinted at in the official production image of Valinor that was released a couple months back, acted as a cheat sheet, quote, for the creative team, saying the writers have a lot of fun in extrapolating it all out. As ever, that's about all we're getting for now. But
we're getting a lot. I mean, that's interesting to see that happen, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it just sort of the female heroes thing is sort of like that could go many different directions. Are we getting warriors? Are we getting what can it mean? I guess
I was like, does that mean we're getting another Tauriel? Which she wasn't a massive mistake, but she was intermittently a mistake.
And an attempt was made, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, if you can do it right, obviously I'm all for, theoretically this, but I worry that it's going to be like girl power, kind of. No, that sounds wrong. I mean, sorry. I'm coming off of a long weekend. Not thinking clearly, but
like the corporatized girl power.
The capital letters strong female character, you can tell she's strong because of the violence she commits, that kind of thing. Yeah, the girl boss,
Instead of embracing certain traditionally quote unquote feminine displays of power, and maybe sort of doing something interesting with that, subverting those expectations, but maybe not in a violent way.
Yeah, there's a spectrum of female character, a feminine character out there, and feminine. And if they're all like if they're all Tauriel, then it's like this is just no.
This is just a dude. This is a female character clearly conceived and written by a man who thinks that power, like that the ways in which power is wielded can only be male. Like, does that make sense?
The aggressive violence.
Yeah,
sort of,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm not super worried in some ways, just because if Galadriel is a main character, she's, at least in Lord of the Rings itself, is more like, this is all like
quote unquote,
masculinity, femininity are culturally defined, all that kind of thing. Of
course.
With like, anyway, she's like feminine power, so she's like a hostess kind of thing going on. She's the lady, she's all that. And then there's Tauriel. But well, Galadriel in her youth famously was an Amazon, so
Right, yeah. I was going to say, if we're going to get a version of the Skiri, or however you pronounce the island on here, and some sort of like, elvish Amazon like warrior team, it'll be like, what?
Yeah.
So, not that we have any hint of that, frankly. So, I tend to think, I would sort of mention this to our listeners, I mentioned this in a sort of a Slack chat earlier, that my guess is they may be also doing something with the fact that there are officially Númenorian ruling queens. They may do something with that. Maybe that's going to be like a wedge in to sort of explore other things. Unclear. We won't know until we know, because we still don't know much more about this. We've got this, but maybe to talk about Lenny Henry. Quite understandably, I think very, very happy about playing, a part one of a multicultural group of hobbits, for lack of a better term, and is concerned about that. Which, again, I can understand why he would be obviously incredibly happy with that, to see that, and it is interesting to see it happening. It is a conscious change to the way it's been portrayed back with the Jackson films, and I think for the better. Beyond that, it's sort of like we'll see what we see, I guess. This is something that will be reflected in the casting of the other characters, or if we want to call it that, races or species more accurately, I suppose. So,
yeah, what I like about his quote is his distinguishing between, a tribe and not a race. And I think that's like a really great distinction, and really lends itself to a more open way of thinking about these characters, these people, and the world that they inhabit. A tribe can mean a lot, whereas race brings to mind like phrenology and eugenics. So I love this more open way of talking about it and thinking about it. This group of people who are bound by culture and custom, not necessarily skin color. Yeah. And also, I mean, they're also kind of bound by being, 3.5 feet tall, I guess. So there is an element of physical, there is a physical element to this, but I think that's, definitely a better way of thinking about it.
And as I was reminded last year, because they're working on this for Disney Plus, they're working on a Willow TV series based on Ron Howard's fantasy film from New Zealand, is where it was filmed in the late 80s. Really? So hey, weird deep connections. And notably, when I rewatched the film for the first time since I had seen it back in '88 last year, because it is on Disney Plus, it was something that I had completely forgotten about. That Willow's people, obviously, short stature like hobbits, but very, very clearly and consciously a mix of people from different backgrounds. It was something like, you got to give them credit for that. They actually had that down right out of the gate. So it's sort of like, hey, better step ahead. Good job, guys. Yeah. So, that's nice to see.
It will be interesting seeing like what some of the sort of more racist, white supremacist, like the racist corner of the Lord of the Rings fandom, how they'll be reacting to this. I can't wait for all the clutched pearls to be like, what do you mean there's a black hobbit? What are you doing? What do you mean there's a Maori hobbit? No. And it's like, well, they're not Maori or black within the context of the show. They're just there. chill, man. Maybe I'm like creating a person to be mad at. Maybe they're.
I don't know. No, you're absolutely not creating a person to be mad at.
Oh boy,
there is a whole swath of these people.
Right? They do exist.
Well, we hope none of you are our listeners. If you are, how have you stuck around so long? We don't.
Can
want
we change your mind? Like, are we changing your mind? Please tell us.
Yeah, maybe we're making it better. Okay, so we'll take that. And maybe one last thing before we get into main topic stuff is the idea that how the Silmarillion is being used as a cheat sheet. That's interesting. So besides taking away Oriana's TV series,
I know, I'm so close, you guys. I'm so close to being able to actually bring the Silmarillion to television, and here I might be too late. Oh, just
to quote Frodo, near but not in the gold. But it is interesting. It is one of those things that sort of suggests that if they're using it as a cheat sheet, they're not using it to something too directly filmed, maybe, but we do not know. That image was released for a reason. Will it be a flashback? Again, something we can all ponder about, but we'll have other things on our minds. Of course, in terms of fan series, we're absolutely going to get nothing more from Amazon this, because right now they've got a Wheel of Time to sell.
Just a whole Wheel of Time. I'm actually so excited about it. I feel like
I kind of am too at this point. Yeah, so we'll just see how this lands. Because my feeling is, if it does a reasonably enough good job, and that shows that Amazon was able to shepherd it and make it a good, interesting, and exciting series, all right, that's a good sign for what they might be doing with the Tolkien one. We'll see. Oh, I'm so looking forward to the fact when we will no longer have to call it the Lord of the Rings TV series, because it's not going to be called that.
What are they going to call? We don't even really know what they're going to call it.
Are we sure it's not just called Lord of the Rings?
They've been using it as Lord of the Rings on Prime just as a thing, but it's not Lord of the Rings. I mean, so unless they're going to pull this is like Watchmen. It's sort of like, well,
maybe. They might. They might. Oh, wow. That would be
This is something we'll have to wonder about.
Yeah.
I think they basically did that just because they couldn't call it anything else, and we'll get some sort of name. But maybe it'll be like a subtitle thing in much the same way as the anime film that's being done by Warner Brothers is officially Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim for now.
Interesting.
Which again may change.
They're gonna call it some horrible thing like Lord of the Rings, The Beginning, or something like that, aren't they?
The tagline for the Dune movie is on the poster simply "It Begins," which sounds like it's like the third It movie, frankly. So.
I hope that the tagline for Dune 2 is like, "It is happening again."
Yes. There you go. So, by the way, the two of us who have seen the Dune movie rather really like it. So there you go. But we are not a Dune podcast. But we throw out a recommendation.
I know. I can't wait to see it. We definitely wanted to see it. My husband and I wanted to see it in the theater, and then he went and sprained his ankle. So it'll be
he was trying to get us seeing Dune.
He was trying.
Some quiz outs how to rack your husband is. Jeez.
I will say this. Like, he was the one who was like, "We need to see this in the theater." I was like, "Oh, all right. Yeah. Okay."
I would agree. It is worth seeing in a theater. It was a striking experience.
Yeah.
So be safe.
Yeah.
You do that. So, just that's all I'll add. Okay, so we've talked out all that. We should get back to what we're actually here to talk about and all that. So our main topic, and this time is Oriana's choice of topic. So please do take it away.
We're talking about our boy, our best boy, as Jared pointed out, Samwise Gamgee. Yay. And, it's by design, of course, that so many people just immediately identify with Sam, the gardener of the Shire who ends up arguably saving Middle-earth, a number of times. Sam is our audience surrogate. Frodo is kind of the scholar who at least has some knowledge of the forces that have shaped Middle-earth, but Sam's kind of a rube, but he's a curious one. He's someone who loves the Shire as his home, but can appreciate the beauty of the history and other peoples of Middle-earth when he does actually come into contact with them. And that's why he's so central to the story when it comes to perspective. Merry and Pippin sort of are similar, but they immerse themselves in other cultures. Pippin becomes a Knight of Gondor and Merry of the Rittermark. Sam, though, is just Sam. He's sort of our Hearthstone, I feel like. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast has either read or heard about Tolkien talking about Sam as the real hero of the story. Sam is based on the young English soldiers that he served with in World War I. He is constantly described by Tolkien as, quote, rustic, which I know isn't actually a euphemism for hick, but it does kind of feel like the polite British way of saying that. But also, Sam is not without his faults, and one of the more revealing letters about Sam was in letter 246. If any of you all have the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien book, this one is to a Mrs. Eileen Elgar, and Tolkien writes that Sam was cocksure and deep down a little conceited, but his conceit had been transformed by his devotion to Frodo. This devotion, he goes on to say, has elements of pride and possessiveness to it that prevented him from actually fully understanding Frodo. There have been a number of interpretations of Sam over the years since the publication of the books. Of course, there's Sean Astin, we know, and we love a wonderful, wonderful performance. We have Michael Scholes as the voice and Billy Barty as the physical actor in the Ralph Bakshi version. Bill Nighy as Sam to Ian Holmes' Frodo in the original BBC play. And maybe most oddly, an actor, like a New York actor, Lucille Bliss in the 1979 radio play, which is a really, really interesting choice that I think we'll be talking about in a minute. But before opening us up to discussion, I want to share my favorite bit of Sam trivia, which is, so Tolkien received a letter from an actual person named Sam Gamgee in March of 1956. Tolkien was delighted and offered to send them some signed volumes, with some very on-brand self-deprecation about how, you're probably not interested in reading such a long fantastical tale, but, if you were, if you check them out from the library and you like them, I'll, send you some signed copies. And Mr. Sam Gamgee was like, yeah, we would love some, and Tolkien sent them, and then Sam Gamgee, the person, acknowledged their arrival and said, quote, "I can assure you that I have every intention of reading them," quote, end quote, which is maybe the most perfect reaction you could possibly have hoped for. But okay, let's all kind of think back to our first encounter with Samwise Gamgee. Did you find him laughable, lovable, both? What were, first of all, which medium did you encounter him first? Ned, I'm guessing it was it was the Rankin Bass,
and that's actually the one other main interpreter.
Right. I forgot to mention that. Yeah,
but I'll go ahead and talk about it since it was my first. Is that he was? We of course talked about the Rankin Bass Hobbit a few episodes back. I don't think we'll talk about the Rankin Bass Return of the King. Maybe one day we'll force ourselves to do that. Even Rankin called it a mistake, but so that should tell you something. But the voice cast, very interestingly, was Roddy McDowall and playing Sam. And at the time, I did know who Roddy McDowall was. He was certainly a big enough star presence who had been in various things that even as a kid, when I saw the Return of the King in, when did it run? 1980, I think it was, 80, 81. I think it was 81. That sort of like, oh, Roddy McDowall, right. And that's Roddy McDowall, and that's his voice. It's very clearly him. The portrayal in that one is interesting. I don't want to get too much into this because it's more about the portrayal of the character rather than the character, but that is how I first learned about him. And my sense was that very much his strong loyalty, his earnestness. I had, in the same way that I had a complete recording of the Rankin Bass audio on vinyl, as was done back then, in the days, again, before widespread VCR and pre-sold videotape use. There was a shortened version of Return of the King released on vinyl, so not the complete thing, but I got used to Roddy McDowall's portrayal through that. And my sense was, it's a good portrayal, and my sense I got from it is Sam as, it's not the full complexities, of course, of the character from the book, but his earnestness. He wasn't obsequious. I mean, there's plenty of, master, and things like this, but But you do get a sense of him, like, just sort of like being fully participatory in the quest, very much acting when he needs to and so forth. There are other parts about the interpretation that I have issues with, but in terms of carrying across what Sam is like, in terms of the basic core, you can almost say stereotype of him, that's how I learned about it, and it was positive. It was positive.
We're definitely going to put a pin in that little, performance choice because we probably can't for legal reasons, but I encourage everyone to search on YouTube for the 1979 radio play version of The Lord of the Rings that has Miss Lucille Bliss's performance. This is not a knock on Lucille Bliss, who has she's great, but it is very funny to hear a clearly New York accented Samwise Gamgee.
Bart Simpson sort of Sam, right?
And we'll add quickly, too, if you're looking for it, this is the 1979 American radio adaptation, not the 1981 BBC British UK adaptation. Two different things.
Very different.
So, but Jared, how did you first hear about Sam?
Well, as almost a running gag at this point, my mother reading the books to me.
Yeah. It's so sweet, though.
It's so sweet.
Yeah.
I was rereading Lord of the Rings this weekend, focusing on Sam, and so skipping a bunch of parts that don't involve him, and remembering the experience of first hearing about Sam, and thinking he's not important, because for huge stretches of Fellowship of the Ring, he's just kind of there. And Merry and Pippin are important and prominent and stuff.
Guys.
Yeah, I was like, Merry's
so
cool.
much action.
Yeah, Merry's got this sort of swashbuckling gentleman adventure thing going on, and Pippin is the baby, and they're they're doing things. They're Frodo's friends, and Sam is just this guy who's there. And then after a certain point, he becomes more and more prominent. And I wasn't surprised. I was 12. I didn't know how anything worked, but it was it was a subconscious kind of process of going, I like Sam. Oh, Sam. Okay, Sam's fine. Whatever. And then getting to Weathertop or whatever, and Sam is suddenly deeply concerned at all times for Frodo and fighting for him against Strider sometimes and that kind of thing. And I love Sam. And then only getting to the end of Return of the King and going, okay, Sam is clearly the best. Why did I ever care about Merry and Pippin?
Fickle Merry and Pippin.
I know. What were they even doing? Off saving other parts of the world? Who gives a crap? Yeah. So it was the way the story is constructed was just as a kid, just going, I don't know, Sam is whatever, and then by the end going, more Sam, please. Where's Sam? I want to hear more about Sam. He's my favorite of the hobbits, or however that part in the book goes.
He's
I like his talk. That's what it was.
Yeah, he's quote unquote rustic. It's amazing how often this word comes up. And again, I know it's not meant as an insult at all, or I don't think it's meant as an insult. Sort of a backhanded compliment. Does that
coded,
count? Yeah,
isn't it? It's coded.
There we go. Thank you, Ned. That's the word.
Well, it's coded in interesting ways. It's a word that I don't know if this is going to come across as unfairly pretentious, but whatever. I went to art school. I can do that. I have a license that says I can do this.
Yeah.
It reminds me of in Shakespeare plays, there's a character who's the rustic or whatever, who's sort of folksy and ridiculous, but also necessary, usually, to whatever is going on. So I think that's the coding. It's more theatrical coding than cultural, I think.
It can vary. I mean, I'm thinking of things this is an extreme example, and an author more unlike Tolkien I couldn't imagine, and yet maybe weirdly having strange connections. Good old Karl Marx, where you have a translation from either the Manifesto or Das Kapital, where or somewhere else. If I remember the quote right, he is talking about the idiocy of rural life, meaning the idea that, of course, it's in the cities where all the geniuses are, and we develop ideas as opposed to those, backwater rustics or however you want to phrase it. But that coding is there. And yet at the same time, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to go on. I could go off, but I actually want to turn it back to you, Oriana. What more do you have to think about?
My first experience, I do kind of have difficulty remembering my first experience of reading The Lord of the Rings before the movie came out, because it was so close. I was, 13 going into 14 when I first read The Lord of the Rings, like, properly. Fellowship came out December, like 6 months after I had turned 14. So there was not a lot of time, and Sean Astin's performance did imprint on me, like, very, very immediately. But I do remember thinking, Sam is such a crybaby. He is forever bursting into tears. And that like stuck with me and was actually something I was really glad didn't happen in Sean Astin's performance. I was, like, genuinely relieved, because despite being an extraordinarily cringy teen, I don't think I could have handled the cringe of a fully grown man just bursting into tears at the drop of a hat. Almost literally, it feels like. That was my major impression of him. But then I do remember going through and being like, oh, well, yeah, this is a moment to cry in, when you're sitting on the slopes of Mount Doom and you're definitely going to die, and you're just glad you've got your buddy with you.
Aww.
At the end of all things. Just, oh my good, oh, how many times did I write that in people's yearbooks? How many times?
Wow. I approve. There's your cringe right there. Best kind of cringe.
I was just the most cringe you've ever seen. And thankfully most of you did not see that. I don't think anyone who knew me then listens to this.
Yeah.
So
sorry, thinking of all the cringy Tolkien stuff I did as a teen.
Right, like, there was a lot. There was so much.
Oh, I mean, hey, who learned how to always add his signature in Tengwar to his signature? Hi.
Yes.
Endless checks signed with that if I still had them around, which I don't.
I will say this. Well, you know what? Actually, I'm going to leave this for when we talk about adaptation and performance. But so I didn't have time to go back and re-listen to our whole episode that was Jared's wonderful topic about, like, friendship and homosociality. But of course that comes to the fore here with Sam, who is, you cannot talk about Sam without talking about his relationship with Frodo. And did either of you guys read that as queer when you were younger? Did you, like, gravitate to a queer, like, sort of interpretation of it? Did you write any fanfic, either of you? I didn't, but I'm kind of mad at myself for not doing that.
Look, none of my fanfic was about this, so...
Okay.
And I didn't write fanfic as such.
Well...
I mean, other projects, yes.
Wow, other projects, yes.
Oh, I think I mentioned I almost wrote a module on Linden for Iron Crown Enterprises Middle-earth games back in the late 80s or something like that. It almost happened, but that fell by the wayside. Long story.
I love these glimpses into, like,
the very
just
tapestry
Ned's
of Rich's,
yes,
the rich and varied tapestry of Ned's life.
Yes.
You make it sound a lot more interesting than it is, believe me. Thank you, though. Did I think of that consciously? No, I can't say I did. I took it. I mean, keep in mind, I'm learning when I am 9 years old, 10. And it's also 81 when that type of thing is not necessarily in the cultural framework to talk about either at school or at home. Fairly conventional, however you define convention, what that means in terms of growing up. So keep that in mind too. So for me, it was just simply a friendship. I consciously knew about, friends, buddies. I had my own, and as an elementary school kid, classmates and people I knew and things like that. And I just simply read it along those lines. Yeah. And I'm sure I'd had, other cultural senses of buddies, pals, things like that. So from various sources, books I'd already read, movies I'd already seen. So nothing about that stood out to me. And keep in mind, of course, I hadn't read the book, of course, at that point.
Oh, right.
So when I read the book a few years later, and took that all in for the first time? It's a really good question. I have a very specific memory of reading the book for the first time, that wonderful Christmas 83 into 84, when I was just like, I remember just like getting to the Moria sequence, like, way late at night, I'm sitting up in my bed just going, and all that.
Yes.
Marvelous memories. That was that big full rush. But did Sam and Frodo's relationship take on necessarily a new shift for me at that point? I don't know. My sense is that I was still taking it in.
Yeah.
And maybe sort of like it took further readings, further things, and me just growing up and me sort of thinking about things in new ways and going through new experiences to then read it maybe one way and then another way after that point. I think I would have just simply taken it as part of the whole just wonderful tapestry of the work.
Yeah.
Might be the best way to put it. That would be my experience about thinking about it in terms of any queer reading or homosocial reading.
Did it actually affect at all the way that you viewed your own friendships with other like male people?
That's a fair question. I would generally say I've never been through an experience, even conceptually, quite the same way.
Right.
Let's put it that way. I'm not saying I have a one-to-one experience. I've gone and have to worry about helping someone throw in a dark ring somewhere or whatever and all that. Not claiming that. That's a very fair question, though. I would say no. It more evolved in other circumstances, especially given the fact that while there were some bondings I made in terms of direct friendships over liking Tolkien face to face as part of a thing, it really wasn't a crucial or key one in terms of the friendships I had if we're talking middle school and into high school.
Sure.
And then by the time I went to college, it took on another form again. The closest it would have been certainly my involvement in fan circles through newsletters and things at the time in the 80s. But for the most part, that was a distant one, strictly through the mail. I mentioned, like in the last episode, about how I knew Carl Hostetter and things like that through the meeting of the Vineyard Tengwar folks. Yeah. That was a one-off and other things like this, but that was not constant.
Yeah.
Only my co-writer on the piece we did on Tolkien astronomy, Jorge Quinones, he'd be the closest one I knew to that, and we were very much companions and friends on that level, but it wasn't a deep, active, continuing friendship.
Right.
So keeping that in mind, it was one of those things that framing it in my head as a model for the friendships I had, not consciously. Unconsciously, who knows?
Right.
That's a good question, though. It's a good question. Jared?
It's such a hard question to answer. And I feel like most of my answer would be in that friendship episode, which I don't remember anything I said, so I'll probably repeat it now. As a child of 12, and I was very much a child at 12, partly for being homeschooled.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, sidebar, I suppose. I didn't know anything about queerness at that age.
Yeah.
Because even though my parents belonged and still belong to a pretty homophobic church, they didn't talk about that kind of thing.
Right.
So I didn't know what the word gay meant for...
Right. How could you? Where would you have...
Nobody... Yeah, because they weren't sitting around hating on the gays. They're nice people. They're not going to do that. So I didn't know what that... I didn't even have a negative framework for this. Right. It was just like, I don't know. So there are still moments that in this friendship that kind of pinged for me in a specific way that I now recognize. But as a child, I found them kind of embarrassing in that way that somebody displaying raw emotion is embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Rivendell when Frodo wakes up and Sam grabs his hand and strokes it and blushes. I was like, it was uncomfortable because
you can't do that.
Can't do that. I didn't know how to react to that, so I defaulted to shame.
Yeah.
As I so often do.
Of course.
well, let me ask a question then that's very important in that context. Famously, of course, Ian McKellen persuaded Sean Astin to make sure that moment made the film, and they made the case for it. So you read the books, and then shortly thereafter, you're seeing it on screen. Mm-hmm. How did you feel when you saw that?
Well, it's not that prominent. I mean, it's a wide shot.
Yeah,
Sean Astin grabs his hand.
You have to know to look for it.
But it's not... It's not made as much of.
Right. Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying.
Totally.
So I was like, oh, there it is, and then move on, because the movie was not interested in that expression of emotion in the way that the book is. And that, I guess that kind of pulls back to whether, reading the relationship is queer, is that I think you can, but I don't think It's hard to say what the intent is here, because there's
Right.
I don't know how famous this is, but there is that epilogue that was cut where from the books where Sam is talking to his daughter Eleanor, and she refers to Frodo as his treasure, and it's extremely gay. But that was cut, and what remains, there's a lot of these moments that are similar in this kind of spontaneous outpouring of affection, but then they are subsumed once again by a quote-unquote normal friendship and by the servant-master relationship that eventually erodes away.
Yeah.
What was the original question? I got lost in the weeds here.
I think you've answered it. And if you would, I'm like 98% sure we talked about this extensively, and like viewing Frodo and Sam as a model, as any kind of model of friendship. Did you actually like at any point sort of consciously think about that when making friends, having relationships? No.
Most of my friends were women.
I will say this, though. I did kind of map that relationship onto a boy at school that I was kind of in love with, but was gay. But I was like, this is a purer form of love then, because I'm just devoted to him.
Going full ancient Greek here, I see.
For sure.
Yeah. Right with you.
I would follow him to the ends of the earth as friends.
Yeah.
And like...
I would follow you to the ends of the earth. No homo.
There is this like fascinating no homo, quote unquote, in one of the, was it one of the letters or bio? I think it's in one of the letters where Tolkien is writing about how crucial it is that Sam have Rosie.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, man, I guess. It's like, just because she's not like really in the book doesn't mean she like that relationship isn't important. And it's like, I mean, I guess.
I see where he's coming from.
I do too, but also...
This is part of the stuff we were sort of sharing back and forth in prep for the episode. I went and dug into... Well, let me back up. Famously, the idea is again it's idealization, you could almost say, of the soldiers that were under his command. It should be noted in World War I, and how Sam grows out of that. The exact quote from the biography. I'm going to quickly dig it up here. I've got it. Where is that? Here we go. Is that discussing one of the principal characters in The Lord of the Rings, he wrote many years later, quote, "My Sam Gamgee," in quotes, "is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batmen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself." Now, a little background extra context here can be found in the very good book by John Garth, Tolkien and the Great War, which to this point is the most in-depth study of Tolkien, indeed, during the war. And it emphasizes something about friendship in kind of two levels. Now, first I'll dig out a couple of bits from Garth's book, talking about, again, his experience of these men under his command. So it talks about initially about some of the people who were in the Lancashire Fusiliers, the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers, that were under him, and as one of a number of officers. So talking about who these men were, most of the rest had been in France for 9 months now, miners or weavers in the close-knit Lancashire towns of Burnley, Oldham, Bolton, Wigan, Preston, and Blackburn. North Lancashire miners also dominated a 2nd battalion. A further battalion had been recruited from white collar workers in the Wirral, Cheshire, etc., etc. And then here's a further quote. "Tolkien felt an affinity with these working class men. He had, after all, spent significant portions of his childhood either in rundown urban areas of Birmingham or among laboring folk in the villages on the outskirts of the city. But military protocol did not permit him to make friends among the quote-unquote other ranks. He had to take charge of them, discipline them, train them, and probably censor their letters, the kind of job that would be done by any officer available, whether platoon commander or not. If possible, he was supposed to inspire love and loyalty." And then we mentioned I mentioned that Tolkien quote, which is talking about the batmen specifically. So leaping a little bit further ahead in the book, this is talking about him, of some of his fellow officers, and then mentions dinner and whiskey were served by the batmen, and then mentions, just unfortunately we have their last names, Harrison, Arden, and Kershaw. He then goes into a further explanation. The batman performed domestic chores for an officer, making his bed, tidying and polishing, and furnishing his table with the best. This was a practical arrangement, not just a luxury. Officers undoubtedly led a cushier life than the other ranks, but they had little time off to spare from training, directing working parties, and on days off, censoring the letters home. Skipping ahead a bit, a resourceful Batman could win a great deal of gratitude and respect. Tolkien, who found it hard to warm to his fellow officers, developed a profound admiration for the Batman he knew. However, the Batman was not primarily a servant, but a private soldier who acted as a runner for officers in action. As such, he had to be both fit and intelligent, so that he did not garble the orders or reports. And like any other private, he also fought in the field. And there's further details there about, unfortunately, many casualties that were suffered, including among the Batmen. So this, I don't want to say complicates the picture that is given from that little quote, but it gives a certain richness to it, which is a reminder that there was a division, a line that could not be crossed. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and this is something that Tolkien in the Great War, the book, really emphasizes, he did, of course, have his incredibly close friendships among the people he knew from his school days, who also went to war, who were also fellow officers, and died. I would argue maybe this is something that hasn't been necessarily discussed about, is how we're basically seeing Tolkien trying to blend the two in a way. Mm-hmm. He's the deep emotional, direct connected friendships that he could indeed did experience among men, among people, many young men of his age that he knew, who in this context, in the framing of a relationship where that friendship could not happen because mm-hmm. it was strictly professional. Mm-hmm. It was other ranks. You weren't going to just simply be around and simply, to be frank here, shoot the shit with privates or batmen. It wasn't going to happen. That type of familiarity that we see doesn't occur. And yet we see in this description the reflection of, again, what is Sam doing? He is preparing the meals. He's doing these things. He's trying to keep an eye on things. There is the sense of a professional obligation, even though it's not really spelled out as such in the course of the story. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there. I mean, there's a lot more I could say, but I want to bring this into the fore here, maybe because a question to ask is, how is there a danger of idealization of these relationships? Yes. Is Tolkien trying to essentially round hole square peg? Can he cross these two things to make it actually work? The deep friendships versus this type of thing? I mean, I don't know.
I think that is kind of right on the money. And this is just pure projection on my part, projection and conjecture, let's call it. Yeah. But it does kind of feel, Ned, as you were saying, when you are going through the horrors that Tolkien and all of the other people who fought in World War I were going through, it feels ridiculous to keep adhering to these boundaries, these arbitrary, certainly in that context, seemingly arbitrary boundaries, when you're like, I am fighting and dying and bleeding with these people. What do you mean we can't just have a normal sit down session and just see each other as the people we are? Mm-hmm. And I think that does feel like that comes into play, particularly in Mordor, when everything is awful and it's the two of them. Sam is still very much serving Frodo in a variety of different ways, but there is the boundaries feel as though they have dissolved. The mental boundaries, I guess, the distance between them from servant to master is gone. And I think that is quite astute.
Thank you.
It's gone, and also at that point, Frodo is basically just dissolving.
Yeah,
and so mm-hmm. It's almost like maybe, Sam is doing all the stuff that a Batman would have been doing. Yeah. And then some, but with far more justification.
Right,
so
right.
He's creating the conditions where this relationship works in an ideal way because it has to.
Yeah, Frodo literally can't even walk anymore,
I don't know if I want to do an entire episode about this, but I've been thinking for a while about how chunks of Lord of the Rings are utopian fiction, the Shire section mm-hmm. specifically, mm-hmm. and this, mm-hmm. to me, this feels like an extension of that in a bizarre way. And I don't know if that's a real connection or something that I'm just kind of, but where this sort of idealized thing is happening and it's good, but also may not apply to the real world in the way that a lot of utopian fiction does.
Right.
Mm-hmm. There's something I want to bring up. I do want to make sure we get into more of the interpretations and what actors and things have said and what was done following your lead there, Oriana. But there's another quote I want to bring up from the Elgar's letter that you read earlier. It's right before that section, because that ties into two of my favorite instances of Sam in the book, which are near the start of the book. Mm-hmm. And I think is especially, and I should go back and reread to see how soon Tolkien brought them in terms of including this, but I think they're the type of things that sometimes go a little unremarked in terms of, you could say, the depth of Sam's character and what he's thinking about and how he does things. And first I'll read the quote from the letter. Sam can be very trying, in quotes. He is a more representative hobbit than any others that we have to see much of, and he has consequently a stronger ingredient of that quality which even some hobbits found at times hard to bear: a vulgarity, by which I do not mean a mere down-to-earthness, a mental myopia which is proud of itself, a smugness in varying degrees and cocksureness, and a readiness to measure and sum up all things from a limited experience, largely enshrined in sententious traditional wisdom. Insert comment here about current political scene.
I mean, it's just America. It's just America. All of America.
I'm just saying. Anyway, to continue the quote. Applicability, not allegory. To continue the quote. We only meet exceptional hobbits in close companionship, those who had a grace or gift, a vision of beauty, and a reverence for things nobler than themselves, at war with their rustic self-satisfaction. Beautiful phrase. Imagine Sam without his education by Bilbo and his fascination with things elvish. Not difficult. The Cotton family and the Gaffer, when the travelers return, are a sufficient glimpse. Now, we could certainly talk about that scene, but what I'd like to talk about instead is the scene that's in the Green Dragon, where it's Sam and the cronies, and it's just them. Frodo's not there. And Sam is the one who is, gets sort of wistful and mournful. He has that little there, sailing.
Yeah.
Dude.
That is something that, in a lesser book would have been Frodo's expression if he were hanging at the pub thing, because that's how Frodo is more characterized. Instead, we get it from Sam. And Sam, even though he seemed to be, on the one hand, this, again, use the word rustic here and all that, in fact, he's clearly, thinking thoughts here. He is not consciously a scholar. He is learning things, and having learned things, but having done that, having been encouraged to learn things and following that interest, he's expressing that in a classic case where somebody in any comparative thing and experience, somebody gets into, hey, what about deep thoughts, man? And everyone else is like, how many times has that happened? Or maybe we feel pressure to make it happen, or things like that, past experience. That's very, very relevant, I think. And I think it's a very astute observation. It is reductive, maybe to a degree, but I think there's something very interesting about Tolkien making the case for this. And how he's phrasing it is that the idea is, it ties back to this idea of utopian fiction. Tolkien clearly isn't necessarily regarding the Shire as a utopia because of something like this. He's like, this is the flaw. This is the downside. And he's consciously saying this. It sort of goes against, this now expands out larger criticism. Is Tolkien truly celebrating, a vision of merry England in terms of the Shire? Not really. Not necessarily.
Only sort of.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's a much more nuanced view, I think.
And having Sam express that in that thing, that's a very interesting incident. Again, have it before anything happens. Yeah. Having it before we get anywhere. It's sort of like the deeper waters are actually there. And we have more instances of that come along as they do. Famously, as moments when he suddenly breaks out into poetry or things like that. Just sort of like it's as kind of as I think you were saying, Jared, he seems to disappear, and yet he seems to be taking it all in, though quietly at the same time, even if he pretends not to understand it all.
Sam is consistently the hobbit who comes up with poetry, whether reciting it or composing it. Frodo occasionally indulges, but none of the others do. They'll sing Hobbit songs, but Sam is the one who knows the song about Gil-galad and all that. So it's doing something else in a way that even though he's like allegedly the uneducated rube, the landed gentry that he's traveling with aren't really thinking in these terms.
Yeah, I think that it is sort of that utopic view of what the average Englishman could be when given the opportunity to break out of that kind of myopic mentality. As Sam is, he's kind of forced into it. But Ed, as you pointed out, even before this is happening, he wants more. You can just kind of picture him singing a sort of like Disney-esque. Yes, you can totally. And that I do remember that moment in The Green Dragon when Sam goes, they're sailing. That stuck with me the very first time that I read it. I remember because it was just so beautiful, and it made me kind of instantly love Sam. That whole scene is perfectly calibrated to make us love Sam because he's being ganged up on by these mean little jerks.
Yeah, when I was rereading a bunch of Sam stuff in preparation for this, I read that scene, of course, and then got to Return of the King and the Scouring of the Shire, and they get back to Hobbiton. And what is his name? Ted, the miller's son?
Ted Sandyman,
He mocks Sam's sailing thing. Like, he's so petty. He stored it up for over a year. And
right? It's like, that lived in your head rent-free, didn't it?
And it's I never noticed it before, but it's kind of brutal. Like, it's kind of Wicked Witch of the West mocking Dorothy, like, Auntie M. It's just mean, and you're going to take this poor hobbit's dream and just like...
I think we should talk about thinking about complexities of Sam as a character. Maybe after this we should get to the adaptation choices and things like this. Just keeping an eye on the time. Sorry, I don't mean to take over, Oriana, but things like that.
No, so, I love it. I love it.
But I think we should bring up that actually shows really the complexity of Sam's character is, and Jared and I were like had a quick back and forth on this in Slack earlier. The most, for my money, is probably the most tragic thing in the book, and that is when Sam ultimately accidentally crushes what appears to be Gollum's rehabilitation.
Yes.
And that's the scene where, to just give people reminders, because this is not in the movies. Interestingly, Jackson does not add his element.
He makes it worse instead.
Yeah, makes it a flaw. We that'll be something we'll discuss at another time. But it is thankfully captured in the Bill Nye, the BBC radio version. So there has been an adaptation of that moment. Let me go and find the quote of Tolkien himself talking about that moment. Here we go. So, for instance, this is from another one of the letters. I don't think it's the Elgar's letter. I'd have to double check. For me, perhaps the most tragic moment in the tale comes in Two Towers when Sam fails to note the complete change in Gollum's tone and aspect. Nothing, said Gollum softly. Nice master. His repentance is blighted, and all Frodo's pity is, in a sense, wasted. Shelob's lair became inevitable. This is, of course, due to the logic of the story. Again, in quotes, Sam could hardly have acted differently. And then he adds in parentheses, he did reach the point of pity at last, but for the good of Gollum, too late. And it goes on from there. So he says he gets more into Gollum and sort of his role at that point, but just sort of to backtrack this. So Tolkien clearly was very conscious of this being an incredibly tragic moment. And also what is fascinating too is that he does so in a way that's very relatable, in that this is something we know what's happening in Gollum. We get the sense of it from Gollum. I think it's a very beautiful part of the omniscient narrator trying to describe what's going on in Gollum's head. It's really a remarkable passage. And again, Sam wakes up and misses the tone. However, he's paranoid. He loves his master. He's really concerned about Gollum. And his reaction is to go this. So he's not doing anything untoward, and Tolkien acknowledges that, but of course it causes a disaster. The little brief moment of light is now gone and really doesn't return. And what's interesting too is that, of course, neither Sam or Frodo ever learn about it.
So how is it in the story?
Because omniscient narrators are good that way.
Just a
mysterious.
Little slip up.
You raise a good point. But it is fascinating that regardless of the the conceit of the story, it is fascinating that Tolkien is clear that, and maybe this is more initial discussion for like if we were talking more about Gollum or the interaction of the three, which could probably easily be its own episode, I'm sure. But I think this kind of thing is interesting because again, it's not Sam being evil, but without knowing it, he's committed a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. He's done something awful. But again, how familiar is that in real life?
Oh my God.
I can think of examples in my head that I'm not going to talk about here, and some are recent. So in terms of things like, the things where something else should have been said, something else should have been, better perception should have been applied to. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, that's like one of many. My husband and I have no intention to have children, and one of the things that we have talked about extensively is like just those little moments that your parents don't remember, and it's not a thing that was said with the intent to wound permanently. Mm-hmm. But there are so many things that parents can say that will just live in your mind as a child forever, and that can do kind of permanent damage, even though it may be something totally anodyne that you as an adult would never think twice about saying, and yet you're just totally screwed up because of this one little random moment. It's just, that's that. Good job, totally capturing that. J.R.R. Ron.
Gollum is the child they adopted, and they ruined.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
And then that whole letter is fascinating. If you listeners, if you haven't gotten your hands on the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, it's genuinely worth a read. It's fascinating, the good and the bad. Like, there's definitely, we've talked about the weird stuff about women that is just like, oh, come on, dude, what are you doing? Really? But it's really good for really getting into some of this stuff.
His thought processes about
fascinating.
He'll go on, and I can't imagine what the experience of getting a letter from him, what it must have been like, where God. It's like it's thick, it's a thick letter, and you're like, what is he going on about this time? But it's valuable for us now, and because he's being his own visitor's interpretive center. He's like, this is what this moment is doing.
Very good way of looking at it.
They're fabulous and infuriating.
Yeah, that Elgar letter goes on for like a lot. It's like many pages long and has lots of insights, and I think is, again, check it out.
Indeed. Well, we should, again, I'm being the time master here, but Oriana, you have mentioned the adaptations and things like this. Why don't we just move into that as sort of a final section here? So where do you want to start? Who do you want to talk about?
So we won't harp on Lucille Bliss, but it is wild to hear, you can actually hear the New York accent. And it is fascinating. Another accent-related thing. This is just a little note from Sean Astin's or autobiography, I guess. Thank you, Ned, for posting some of those photos of the pages, because I don't have a copy of that. But Sean Astin starts talking about working with a dialect coach and how they created this sort of Cockney-esque accent, which is fascinating to me because Sam is a rustic hobbit. Right. Sam is a rural hobbit, and the Cockney accent is an extremely urban accent. It is like confined to a very tiny part of London.
Born within the sound of Bow Bells. But the thing is, even like, he's not even doing a Cockney accent. Not even
so like
he's doing a West country accent, like Sawyer, like the strong R's and everything. He's not doing Cockney.
So that must have been just for the audition process. That must have.
In rereading that, my thought about was that if we had, Andrew Jack, R.I.P., famously the famous dialect coach who worked on that, he would have been the one. I'm sure that maybe he read that, so I was like, oh, no, it wasn't that. He would be able to tell you it's more like this. I think this is a classic example of an American grabbing onto terms and using them without knowing what's really going on.
If it's not RP, then it's Cockney.
Right.
That's it. There's only two. I think especially an American in like the like late 90s.
You don't have the internet. You don't know what anybody sounds like.
You don't at best you might have, but you wouldn't even have experienced like all the joys of British TV, where you can, hear all these wonderful accents.
It's like people we're still getting people who assume that all people who are Scottish talk the same. Trust me, no.
No, that is actually, I will say, the Lord of the Rings commentary tracks are how I learned about the difference between Northern English accents and Southern English accents, because Sean Bean and Orlando Bloom were like jabbing each other over their accents. And I was like, oh my God, they're different. This is crazy. So I'm not going to rag on Sean Astin too hard here, but it was very funny to me. But Sean Astin was my first exposure to adapted Sam, and I gotta say it was great. And part of that is wrapped up in childhood and seeing this magical thing happen on screen at first. That was definitely just beyond magical for me, and it's so indelible. I genuinely can't imagine anyone else doing that. But I didn't listen to all of the BBC 1981 radio play, but I do think Bill Nighy actually does a good job. Pretty solid.
Yeah, Nye's version is really good. Yeah, it's one of those things I didn't clock until years later. It's like, oh, it's that Bill Nighy. Because at the time he was going by, in the credits, he was going by William Nighy, which obviously same name, but it's one of those things that put to, and the quote from him, the only one I was able to find, I don't know if he's written or done more about this. Let me dig this up. This is just from an interview that he's done just as part of continuing work, because he's done both lots of voice work and did a lot of voice work as well as acting. And the question was asked from him, again, this is from a piece a couple of years ago. You played Sam in the Lord of the Rings radio production. Was that your first? And his response is, no, I did masses of other radio when I was young, 100 plays or something. But the flagships for me were some Dickens. We did Bleak House, we did Little Dorrit, and then, yes, Tolkien. We did Lord of the Rings, and etc. And biggest radio drama of all time. He was asked, does that experience still resonate for you? And he said, absolutely. I often meet people who are 30-something now. They only know me as Sam Gamgee because they were made to be quiet by their parents while in the back of the car during long European journeys. My voice is embedded in their early consciousness. And I love that. That's just a fun little story about recognizing the impact one can have. But it's also interesting, too, because unlike Sean Astin, who admittedly was writing a book versus a short interview moment and all that, so it's a much different thing, is really getting characters. Bill Nighy, you can tell, is one of those things it's part of what I did.
Yeah,
it was part of me as a working actor. And it's notably that he mentions Dickens first, then Tolkien. He clearly has a sense of sort of what it is. But I think that's actually to the good. He is looking at it as a professional who is hired to do a job, as opposed to something necessarily world changing, which is for Sean Astin, of course, a much different experience. So we have to certainly look at it that way. But yes, I would argue that that version, and certainly the whole radio series, it is its own thing. But Nighy is easily one of the best in it. Turning back maybe to Sean Astin, I would argue that besides his evident greatest part, I think we have to give specific credit to the screenwriters team who recognized he was important and made sure that the role worked too. And I think part of that is Peter Jackson's probably affection for Sam, given the fact, of course, that his parents were British. And I don't think there was any specific tribute necessarily or anything meant. Rather is the idea that for him, I think there's a certain fondness for a salt of the earth character in particular, who is coded red as British and things like that, who is not landed gentry of having wacky adventures, who is not the Ringbearer, the person from
or even the scholar, the person who knows all this stuff, all this context.
It's just simply just the regular guy, as close to a regular guy there. And I think that's something that Peter Jackson famously, he was an only child. He was very close to his parents, things like this. I think there is some sort of unspoken connection that this is a way to really sort of honor them to a certain degree. This is just a guess. But I think that's one reason why I think that Sam gets that good treatment that we get in the films. That role of his is earned, and that performance is earned, and they really spend some time on it. You really get a lot of Sam. You don't get all of Tolkien's Sam, but you do get a reasonable chunk in what is a distillation of an incredibly big narrative. Right.
There's an inherent warmth to the character in the performance, and just the eyes themselves. I don't know. There's just something about Sean Astin as Sam. The eyes are just, it's like a puppy.
It just looks nice.
He just, you just want to give him a hug and help him carry his pack. Yes! Some herbs for his stew.
Potatoes.
Right? Imagine being a meme. I hope I never have to deal with that.
It's not pleasant. It's not pleasant.
Sean Bean will pass, and everyone's image of him will be holding up his fingers. So.
But Ned, we put a pin in it way at the beginning of our conversation. Let's undo that pin now and talk about not the Bakshi, the Rankin Bass. There we go. Let's talk Rankin Bass. What?
Well, let's talk Rankin Bass and Bakshi because those two were really the most dominant visual interpretations. Now, unfortunately, there's really not much to say about the Bakshi. Sean Astin's criticism of him is solid and
pretty on the money.
It can't be argued against. Here is Sean Bakshi. Sean Astin's reaction to Bakshi. Basically, he said he hadn't gotten around to fully reading the book, so he was still doing some prep. He had read parts, he got into it, but he really wanted to settle in to get to the full story, which he eventually did with an audio version, which I assume is the unabridged one that was read by, why have I forgotten his name? This is annoying. Anyway, the earlier one, not the current Andy Serkis one, which I need to get around to. Anyway, he said, the panic set in when I made the mistake of watching a videotape of Bakshi's verse. Seeing how Bakshi portrayed the hobbits as predominantly fat, bumbling, stupid characters, I nearly had a heart attack. Please, God, don't let Peter Jackson approach it this way. He then goes on to say, a page later, I had no respect for the bumbling idiot that Samwise Gamgee appeared to be, at least in the eyes of Ralph Bakshi. They just seem like frightened nitwits. Oh, Mr. Frodo, help me. I don't know what to do. Please. I wanted Sam to be heroic and strong, to have integrity. He was a gardener, a working class man. That's the Sam I wanted to portray. There are a lot of interpretations that can be gleaned when you read the book, so bringing it to the screen is not an easy way. There are probably 30 valid ways to depict the hobbits, but I had my own idea of how I wanted Sam to be perceived, and it was set in concrete. What I had in mind wasn't that thing, that animated oaf on the videotape. And I gotta be honest, that's exactly what it is. I have nothing to say about the Bakshi version beyond that. It's a botch. It is. When we get around to talking about the Bakshi film, we'll have things to say. More that's like, sorry, Michael Scholes. I mean, the voice. Yeah. It's a mess. Roddy McDowall's version by default is the one I was more familiar with, and I just think it's just a lot better version. Even though he is animated in classic sort of Rankin Bass, how you handle the Hobbit style, which is a little. Again, Rankin realized they made a mistake with that one. Don't get me wrong, but Roddy McDowall, partially because he is Roddy frickin' McDowall, and is a really, really good actor and all that. It's his very distinct voice, and he is certainly there's staginess in McDowall's version. There's absolute staginess. In a weird way, it actually would have been more appropriate, not that it should have happened, for him to be the Sam in the BBC radio production, because there are a couple of stagey performances in the BBC radio production that McDowall's version would have actually meshed well with. It's not uniquely so, but it could have been in. But McDowall, there's a good warmth, a good dedication. It's not Sean Astin's, but it's something that he captures the feeling of, oh man, you could say. He captures what needs to be captured for a Sam where we're only seeing him at the end of the story. We don't know the full thing. We don't get a full background, but we do have, I think his strongest moment may actually be, there's a crazy moment where he envisions what happens when he envisions having the ring, and it's basically handled by the Rankin Bass team, like, the Temptations, the Choices of Master Samwise scene. That's its own thing. That's all I'm going to say about that. And I do not hold that against, Roddy McDowall at all. He was doing what he was working with. But I think there's a great moment, which is the illustration of the final confrontation on the slopes of Mount Doom. So not the Crack of Doom itself, but it's when Gollum attacks them and all that and fights. And basically, it's Sam and Gollum having their stand down, or what he thinks will be the final stand down. And Gollum, of course, is like, "Oh, please don't." And he finally gets a sense, as Tolkien mentioned, that a little pity is no bad thing. But he's so frustrated. He's just so angry. And of course, we have that in the Jackson film. But I think the way Roddy McDowall delivers it is really good. There's this, it's like, "Oh, curse you, you stinking thing." You can tell it's like Sam is just at the limit, and McDowell handles that well. So you could say it's a performance of moments rather than consistently, clearly this is a great performance.
Yeah.
But when McDowell is given the chance to really sort of nail it, he does nail it, I think. He does do a good alternate read on a very limited portrayal of Sam Gamgee that he couldn't do a full thing in the story about because that's not the way the production was set up.
Yeah.
That would be my take. Oriana, you're the one who brought this up, and you should have the final words.
I brought this up as being like, I'll give myself an easy one, and then everything was very difficult. Yeah, we love Sam, don't we, folks? I do actually. Sean Astin did such a good job, and we don't really need another version of Lord of the Rings. But I oddly wouldn't mind seeing another Sam, like another interpretation. Is that weird?
I don't think so.
We don't need it. But I don't know. Going back and revisiting him, I'm like, I just love this little guy.
I mean, he's endlessly revisitable.
Yeah. So that's my thoughts. You guys, what do you have to say for yourself?
I defer to Jared if you have any final thoughts. So
I don't know how brief this is. Well, I'll bring it up anyway. That temptation scene.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot in there about the ring, but also hobbits, but also Sam, but also, and I think it's cool that this scene exists after so many people being tempted by the ring and trying to steal it or whatever, or having this whole like Galadriel moment over it, that kind of thing. And the last one I remember anyway that we get is this little gardener walking into hell and going, no, I'm not going to make this easier for myself. The ring has found the limits of its own power in facing Sam because it has nothing that he wants.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of beautiful, is that he, like, everybody, even Frodo succumbs, but Sam is the only one who goes like, no, that's silly.
What?
Right.
What are you even talking about, right?
He's safe from it because he doesn't want what it has to offer. I really love that.
I think that's a beautiful moment.
Famously, the only other person who, when directly confronted with the opportunity to take it and doesn't, is Faramir. But Faramir, of course, basically walls himself off saying, I just know. But he knows that if he got it, he probably would fall. Sam gets it. Fan actually has it.
Yeah.
And he resists. Yeah.
This is neither here nor there. But I was looking at the back of the book, and apparently, I don't know why I never noticed this before, Faramir and Sam are the exact same age. They were born in the same year. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's so weird.
Oh, that's crazy.
They're both just like 35 or something.
Oh, yeah. We did not talk about how Sam is like the most fertile of hobbits. He just kept his wife knocked up for like 20 years.
Look, how do we know it wasn't Rosie? Just like...
That's true.
What a way to end this main discussion of an episode, talking about how Sam and Rosie just constantly got it on. That's all I got to say.
Good for them. I'm glad they had a very healthy love life.
Well, we didn't even get into Sam as like the transmitter of the Red Book and all that. That's a whole thing on its own. Like his status as inheritor of everything.
Oh, yeah.
That's all.
We'll just have to come back.
I know.
We'll come back. Yeah.
We can always revisit topics.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we can't bring in further things we realized. Oh, yeah. All right, so now we look ahead to what will be the next episode. Hey, the final episode of the calendar year here, too. So, Jared, what are we talking about?
Well, we agreed as a board collective, as we are, to finally, after 20 years, talk about Fellowship of the Ring. Because, you know...
the Peter Jackson
movie version of Fellowship of the Ring, which came out 20 years ago.
How?
This December. Oh, my God. Oh. So, yeah, and then, you know, next December, we're talking about Two Towers and all that, so you have that to look forward to. But finally, after talking about them literally every episode, we're actually going to talk about the Jackson movie.
Oh my God. I like wish I could go see it in a movie theater.
Yeah.
I'm sure
that was the only one I didn't see in the theater.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
No. Oh, wow. No.
I was very small and I had no money.
Yeah. I don't even know how I saw it. I genuinely, I know that I did and was amazed. I must have somehow
I know how I saw it.
conned
I have the
my
memories.
parents into giving me the $4 or $5,
wow.
however,
Boy, now you've really aged it.
Movie theaters in Central Florida were pretty, the Oviedo Marketplace Mall was pretty cheap. The Regal there.
God.
That was the big Newport Theater for me, but I'll do more talking about that next time.
Yeah.
But it's obviously it's not just simply talking about the movie. It was a cultural moment, the very beginning of one.
Yeah.
There's a lot to go into. Everything from the fact that it happened 3 months after an incredible disaster occurred.
My
that
God.
was things, and just
That's right.
there's a lot going on in terms of place and time and how it was received, and we're nowhere near going to be able to get through all of it. But yeah, 20 years on, it's time to sort of let's grapple with it, because it is the before and after moment. There's the public, in terms of Tolkien, there are two, and in the cultural memory there are two things: the publication and then later popularization of Lord of the Rings, and the Jackson movies. It's as simple as that. That is the splitting point, and it's time for us to really talk about that. So we'll be doing that next time. As mentioned, it will be our final episode of the year, and then we're going to give ourselves a break, things like that. So but look for that in early December. This episode, of course, will be coming out in early November, and we'll save the end of the year thoughts for next time around. Thank you for listening, as always. Much appreciated. You know how to get in contact with us. If not, hey, listen to our little end thing. It's coming up right now. And send us notes, things, and anything you would like along the way. Stay well, stay safe, as always. Stay dry if you're in the middle of a storm like me. And we will see you all next month and talk to you then. Until then, we'll see you. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By the Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm, or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By the Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.